Now I want to take a look at the 33rd President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower. So the five criteria we always look at are growth, finances, international politics, war and security, and did it leave the country better or worse? When we're talking about Eisenhower, we're looking at an era of time that most people look back on as very positive for the United States. And I think economically and in terms of growth, I think that's a fair assessment. I think that you have to acknowledge that the 1950s were a huge time of economic growth for the United States, also cultural growth, growth in power and influence. I think a lot of very good decisions were made with regards to setting the foundations for the United States becoming the dominant world power and an economic engine. I think the interstate highway system was a huge positive decision that kind of shaped the United States and helped increase expansion. I think the ARPA and ARPANET was the first step toward the internet, which is foundational to the U.S. prosperity today. I think the founding of NASA, even if it was done because Sputnik had happened, not necessarily done specifically because Sputnik had happened, but because of the space race, regardless of the reason that it was done, I do think that was a great decision that really took a national identity and made us the technological leaders, made us focused on science and tech and advancing. And I think all of that is a huge boon. And I think he should get very high marks in terms of growth for making a lot of very good decisions that grew the U.S. in terms of power, economic expansion, helped fill out the country, helped interconnect communities. So the interstate highway system, I think all of that gives him very high marks with regards to growth. With regards to finances, I also think the 1950s was a time of economic prosperity, with the exception of I think a minor recession in 1958. The economy was growing throughout the 1950s. On the whole, people were doing better. There were some things I think you can point to with regards to race relations that could have been better, but were still significantly better than most presidents. I think it's difficult for Eisenhower because you're comparing him to Truman and Kennedy and LBJ who followed. Sometimes I think people are overly negative on him because he didn't go as far as those three did, but those three were really exceptional. When you go back prior to them, I would put Eisenhower above FDR in terms of race relations in a lot of ways, which would shock some people. But I think he was less of a person. I think FDR made a lot of compromises to keep the solid South in place and the Southerners in place around redlining. I think Eisenhower is often forgotten. Picked Earl Warren, who wrote Board of Education. He continued the racial integration of the armed forces, which was something started under Truman. He described himself as a progressive conservative, and I think he had positive intentions. Do I think you can be critical of him for not going far enough to enforce Brown v. Board of Education? Absolutely. But I do think that the court that he created was the foundation that wrote that opinion, and that opinion was the foundation that really started the path toward the civil rights movement. And I do think he deserves some credit for that. Not as much as I'm going to give Truman or Kennedy or LBJ later, but I think that's something that still falls on him. And I think that's something that I put toward growth generally. The first area that I'm going to give him negative marks in is international politics. I think Eisenhower's international politics are an interesting contrast. One of the reasons I like the way I'm doing this series is by being able to look at them in order and do comparisons. You can look at what Truman did with regards to the Cold War, and you can look at what Eisenhower did to the Cold War, and you can see the stark difference of why one I praise and one I don't. Truman, in my opinion, didn't really intervene. Well, he intervened, but when he intervened, it was, at least the most memorable ones, were because there was a world power, a great power, a major power attempting to physically occupy a country that did not wish to be occupied. The creation of the Iron Curtain, the need for the Berlin airlift, the Korean War. These were China and Russia invading other countries to force their political views upon them. Eisenhower, on the other hand, didn't allow local groups to make their own decisions if it wasn't in accordance with what the United States wants. The most famous, well, probably the most known example in the United States would be Eisenhower is the one who got us into Vietnam as the French pulled out. I did a whole video on the Vietnam War and how the French basically at this point had decided that they couldn't hold, that the center couldn't hold. They were getting out. They had realized, and I think a lot of colonial powers realized, that as long as you were there, you were the enemy. and it doesn't matter what the ideology is on the other side. The group of people who don't want to be occupied by colonial powers will emerge and gather around whoever your enemy is. And so you're almost creating an opportunity for a group to rise to power without having to argue for the ideology they have, because their argument is that get rid of the colonial powers. And so the French were realizing in Vietnam that there was no path forward it was time to get out. But the U.S. had this domino theory that Eisenhower was pushing. They move in. Now, is Eisenhower the one who escalates? Is Eisenhower the one who, and we'll talk about this with Kennedy, basically really entrenches us in a way that was not escapable? Maybe not. Maybe Kennedy could have come in and pulled out. And maybe if Eisenhower had been the president at the time, we wouldn't have escalated the way that Kennedy did and that LBJ did later to an even higher degree. But Eisenhower is the one who set the foundation of Vietnam. But I think even more, an event I would condemn even more that really haunts us to this day was the Iranian coup and the removal of Mossadegh. Uh, that was just a complete fundamental misunderstanding of Iran. I think we have not yet been forgiven, and probably that mistake is something that is so foundational. I can understand us not being forgiven, particularly since we've never really apologized or acknowledged it in the way that we really should. And it also set the foundation that where we put a weak leader in power, similar to what we did in Vietnam, where we put somebody who was not popular by local standards, someone that we thought we could control in power, and then that decision led to a unpopular regime that was then overthrown and has now become the Islamic State. I think those decisions were horrible, and there were a number of them. There was also the Guatemalan coup. I think the domino theory that was espoused by Eisenhower was incorrectly thought out. I think it was something that caused a lot of harm around the world, and I think it has proven to be inaccurate and just a mistake in places where we didn't intervene in that way. Certainly many of them became communist and went that direction, but also over time they then drifted into, like, Vietnam is a great example. Once we stopped fighting with Vietnam, yes, Vietnam is still Vietnam, but we had the assumption that they would then become a satellite state of China, and that kind of thing didn't happen. The idea I think Truman had was allow states to remain states and not be occupied by great powers. And Eisenhower seemed to have more of a manipulative approach to that, which I think was a huge mistake. So he doesn't get very high marks with regards to international politics. With regards to war and security, and still under international politics, I don't know if I can say this without getting demonetized, but I'll go ahead and say it because I said it in the other video and I didn't get demonetized. Operation Wetback was a horrible decision. The mass deportation of Mexican immigrants, ironically, some of them being, most of it being on land that was once Mexico, in order to have the Bracero program kind of forced upon them, which created in a lot of ways, in many places, a kind of a forced indentured servitude. I think also that falls negatively on Eisenhower, even if it didn't last that long. When you go back and look at the decisions he made, it's something that's very negative. And also the Cuban Revolution and the foundation of the Bay of Pigs, also on Eisenhower. I'm just looking through my list and realizing how many things were negatives with regards to international politics. He's going to be in the bottom half of international politics, of the presidents we've looked at so far. In terms of war and security, I would say he's probably above average. I do think that we made the correct decisions with regards to the post-war buildup for the Cold War. I do think that we had to build, even though he condemned the military-industrial complex because of the Russian intention to expand, because of the Russians' clear intention to territorially expand and general aggression. I think that was a necessary decision, and I think it did work in the way that it was intended with regards to a nuclear deterrence. So I will give him better than average marks with regards to war and security. Not the top, because again, I think a lot of the other decisions he made did set us up to have many enemies going forward. But I think in terms of having America be a strong country, I think he gets positive marks there. And that moves us to better or worse. I do think that Eisenhower overall left a country better than he found it. I do think he broke some dishes in the china shop with regards to international politics, but I think the country itself was much stronger, was much more prepared for technological advancement, had a very strong base to build the country upon in terms of just building infrastructure. And I think Eisenhower deserves a lot of credit for that. So I think he gets relatively high marks there. And where does that put him overall? I think he's not going to be above Truman. I think when I'm looking at the two of them side by side, I think he's going to be below Truman. But I do think I'm going to put him above James Polk. So that means Eisenhower is going to fall in at eighth. I think Eisenhower's presidency was overall a very positive presidency. There are some things that I think are very negative that he did in terms of international politics, but for the country as a whole locally, I think he was very positive overall. I do think I'm giving him a lot of credit for continuing things that I think were built upon later with Kennedy and LBJ. And I think in looking at it and considering what we have coming up, maybe considering too far ahead with regards to Nixon's backslide, I think Eisenhower was accurately describing himself as a progressive conservative, and I think a lot of things he was positive, so he's going to fall at number 8.